Okay, folks, so our next session today will be looking at small cities' dynamics of change in an urban age. We've got three speakers, David Satterthwaite, Natasha Konia, and Srilata Sirkar. And again, we'll have quite short presentations, 15 minutes each, but then there'll be much more time for discussion afterwards so we can continue the dialogue then. So I'm going to hand over now to David.
Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to mention the word smart once in this 15 minutes, and I apologize for that in advance. But what INR invited me to do was to come and talk about the key findings from work we did on small cities in the 1980s. Incidentally, one word of advice for the teams. We were working in Ghana, and there was an NGO that called itself Other Stakeholders. So all you had to do was to invite this NGO to your conference, and you could say all stakeholders took part. God, my eyesight's so bad I can't see my own slides. The interest in the research that we did was in understanding small urban centres or intermediate urban centres, and I'm not going to bore you with the definitional discussions. But we did research in the early 80s with teams in India, the Sudan, Argentina, and Nigeria. And what we did is we took regions and we tried to understand how the urban system had evolved over a period of 140 years. So we were taking the perspective from 1850 to the 1980s, trying to understand why some cities grew, why some cities didn't. What were the social factors? What were the economic factors? What were the deeply political factors in which cities grew and which cities didn't? And we got some questions. In the three districts we were looking at in Karnataka, why was Bangalore so much more successful than Mysore, when Mysore had actually been more important politically, more important economically 200 years previously? And this is where you come up against these wonderful suggestions. Why did Bangalore boom and Mysore fall? Well, partly it was Napoleon. Napoleon's advisors were advising the government of Tipu Sultan as they fought against the British colonial rule. And one of the reasons that Bangalore became so important, it was a place where the British could concentrate their troops, could get their troops fast from Chennai, worried about what was happening in Mysore. Then in Bangalore, the British used it as a munitions industry and as an arsenal during the 1930s and 1940s, worried that if they chose Chennai or Mumbai, it would be open to sea attack. When you bring munitions experts, you've also got a lot of expertise in space, and so much of India's space program got located in Bangalore, which then attracted a lot of software, computer specialists, and so on and so on. In a sense, there's all sorts of fascinating reasons why a city grows and a city doesn't grow. We identify some of them, but very difficult to assign which is the most powerful and which isn't. In the three districts we looked at in Uttar Pradesh, there was one city that suddenly started booming in 1971. And we couldn't figure out why, because it had no obvious comparative advantage over other cities in the region or others close by. Why in the region in Argentina did we look at? Did one particular city that wasn't doing particularly well suddenly speed up and become the dominant city? In all regions, what interested us, sometimes prosperous agriculture was associated with booming small towns. Other times, prosperous agriculture was associated with very little local development. Trying to get into these, trying to answer these questions. Some things that surprised us, how old many urban centres were. How the list of urban centres in these three regions didn't change much, but the relative position of the urban centres did. So you had some that would do better and go up the size scale, others that would go down it. For instance, in the Nigerian region, the key port in the southwest of Nigeria in the 1850, 1860 was Badagry. Now, who's ever heard of Badagry? It's only got 20,000 inhabitants now, and of course what happened is that Lagos took over from Badagry because it better suited the colonial regime. And so what had previously been a successful port absolutely got marginalized with the new spatial economy. The incredible diversity in the urban centers, you know, take 3 districts of India, 35, 40 different urban centers, enormous diversity in their economic base, in change, in capital coming in migration going out, differences in links with the surrounds, to what extent were they linked to cities outside of the 3 regions. And of course, the incredible differences in the competence and capacity of local government. One of the things I think is hugely important, which I'll come back to. I don't know how many of you are listening to the Reith lectures. They're fascinating lectures on the impact of war on development. Well, war and railway lines are also important. I believe that Bangalore got its railway because the British wanted to move troops quickly from Chennai. The Argentinian region only got a railway because there was a threat of a war with Chile in 1896, and the Argentines decided they needed to have a railway to take troops in. Badagry, interestingly enough, didn't get a railway because it was no longer seen as a threat to the British colonial rule. If Badagry had got a railway, then maybe it wouldn't be a kind of completely marginalized port. We were also fascinated into the substantial proportion of the population that live in urban centers of under 20,000. There's many countries where 10% of the national population is in urban centers under 20,000. Of course, these small urban centers have huge importance, not only for their own population, but for the surrounding rural population in providing public services. Also, in theory at least, the rule of law. Now, we've got this example from this small region in Argentina where prosperous agriculture drove very rapid urban development. And we can see it as the farmers moved to high-value crops, apples, pears, wine, grapes. We could see it in the local urban centers that were serving the local farmers, that were serving the local farmers' consumption needs, and that were serving the forward and backward linkages. If you're doing apples and pears, you can do jams, you can do sweets, you can do all sorts of items that add value. And what you found in this 700 square kilometer region is rural and urban supporting each other, a kind of virtuous spiral where everyone was prospering. Go a little bit north to one of the cattle ranches in the Pampas, and is certainly very prosperous for the owners, but generating very little local employment, generating very little local multiplier linkages. For the large cattle owners, their main links were with national capitals and national ports, not with the local urban centers. I don't know if this is still the case, but in the South India region, close to Bangalore, there are many taluks, many sub-districts that use mulberry silk as one of their main crops. Now, mulberry silk should be a valuable commodity, generating all sorts of value-added in the locality. But of course, with Bangalore close by, it was Bangalore that was capturing all the value added from the silk. They made the clothes and the saris, they marketed them, they advertised them. So here was what should have been a very prosperous agriculture, not supporting a prosperous local urban population because the multiplier linkages were outside. And Sao Paulo was a coffee town. Sao Paulo first came to power as a very successful coffee town. So don't underestimate the extent to which a prosperous agriculture can produce a city that then begins to attract investment, including investment outside of agriculture. Of course, this depends on the value of the crop per hectare. Actually, these are obvious. The jobs with the local enterprises. Also, critically, the landowning pattern. In the Argentine region, the landowning pattern, for interesting historic reasons, was quite equitable. lots of farmers had prosperous 10-acre farms. If the land ownership had been much less egalitarian, very, very large production units, they would have had links direct with the national capital and the national port. So again, it's the income distribution has quite a strong influence on how much local development is generated. Of course, there's key roles. A well-functioning urban government provides services that are needed, but also generates a lot of employment. One of the interesting things, you had General Roca, which was the leading city in the Argentine region for many decades, suddenly losing out to Neuquén. And you had to look very carefully as to why. And the reason was Neuquén was made provincial capital. And by being a provincial capital, it attracted more state funding, which then allowed it to develop and to compete with General Roca. And slowly, a lot of enterprises were moving from General Roca to Neuquén. Of course, if there's no urban government, there's no local boost. One of the cities I've been to recently in Malawi, with 60,000 inhabitants, has no local government. There's no money to support a functioning local government, and the political circumstances are making it difficult to form it. So in this instance, local government wasn't a supporter for development. National governments often set up schemes that are apparently to take migration away from the large cities to the small cities. But most of the ones that I've seen, it's in the end, it's political decisions who gets supported in the secondary cities, not a rational analysis of where there is competence, where there's capacity, where there's the possibility of success. And in the North India region, this puzzle, this small town that suddenly started growing very, very rapidly, it got an enormous tractor factory located in it, and it just happened to be the political constituency of Mrs. Gandhi. So clearly this traffic factory was all around rewarding your constituency. It wasn't around finding secondary cities that have good potential for growth rapidly. We had the examples that interest me most of secondary cities or small cities booming is where they have a competence that they can attract foreign capital or national capital and do so in competition with the big cities. So Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro for decades dominated all the inward investment. But slowly these very well-run cities like Curitiba and Porto Alegre began to provide a viable alternative. They were nicer to live in, they were cheaper, they were better governed. So, hang on, I know. The interesting thing for me is that there was no national program to support Porto Alegre or Curitiba. What supported them was the return to democracy, a strengthened local democracy, changes in the constitution that were very pro-local government, new revenues allowed to local governments, and above all, elected mayors and elected city councils for the first time. And this then provided the context for them to grow, to develop, and to begin to attract investment themselves. What we've seen in Latin America is a new generation of mayors who would never have stood for mayor under the old political regime. Indeed, they couldn't because the mayors were appointed. Often from outside the traditional political parties, professionals, an outstanding one who was a public health engineer or an academic or engineer, I said, public health specialist. You had this interesting range of mayors very committed to their locality, very committed to democracy, very committed often to participatory budgeting, where they return to the inhabitants of each district some rights to prioritize public investment. And I can't stress too much the role of trusted mayors, mayors who were re-elected successfully, strong local democracies, strong social movements, strong civil society, all producing much more successful cities. I suppose then I reflect on the development advantages of strong local government-led development. If small cities in India are already successful and well-governed and have revenue and have investment capacity, they could certainly drive their city towards more success in the changing world, which may include aspects of a smart city. But it's rooting the decisions and rooting the resource allocations locally that I think has huge importance. So just to characterize, some small city advocates would say create an articulate hierarchy of infrastructure and the small urban centers will boom. We're saying give local governments more power, more competence, more capacity, more accountability, and they will produce a much less centralized urban systems. For those of you that are interested in this, do email me. We've written extensively on these case studies of Porto Alegre, Manizales, this wonderfully innovative Colombian city, Ilo, an amazing Peruvian city where elected mayors transformed the city in a period of 10 to 15 years from one of the most awful cities in Latin America to one of the nicest to visit. The city of Rosario, with its huge success over 3 mayors, over 5 mayoral terms, all belonging to the same political party. And of course, Curitiba and Durban. And those that want these, just email.